Hello everyone, Miss Meek here, and today we are going to be talking about histograms. Histograms is a type of data representation that uses a graph to show continuous data in intervals. So let's take a look at what a histogram looks like. This is a histogram, so this is a histogram tracking the number of minutes for something. It could be practicing something or reading or walking your dog or whatever. The histogram is a type of bar graph. However, you may notice that bar graphs usually have spaces between the different bars. Histograms do not. And if you notice, this histogram is one piece of what's called continuous data. Continuous data means that it has no spaces, it has no gaps. Every single one of these columns accounts for every single bit of data that is in this histogram, that was in the data list. It shows every single one. So it shows the frequency of how many times these numbers come up. So what's important about this? Well, things that I can tell from a histogram is I can tell where most of my numbers are. So I can see right here from this big red bar that there is quite a bit of numbers in the 6 to 10 range. So I don't see my data. I can't see the actual numbers of my data, but I know that there are actually 12 numbers in my data from the 6 to 10 range. They could all be 6s, they could all be 10s, they could be a combinations of 6, 7, 8, 9s, and 10s. That we don't know for sure. We cannot actually see the specific data in a histogram, but we can get a really good generalization of where all of the numbers are. For example, I also know that the least amount of my numbers is over here in this green column from 11 to 15. So I only have 4 numbers that are from 11 to 15. So it tells me that the bulk of my data is in the middle there from 6 to 10. I have a few numbers greater than 10. I have some numbers that are less than 6, but most of my numbers, a big part of my numbers, is in that middle section. And so it gives you a summary of your data and where all of your numbers are kind of hanging out. So let's talk about how do I make a histogram. Well, first of all, you have to make intervals. That's a big part of histogram, is that you have these intervals down here, and that is how you organize your data. So that's what you have to start off with. You have to look at your numbers and kind of see, okay, what's my lowest number? What's my highest number? And then make what's called a frequency table. That's step number 1. So we have to pick our intervals. Keep it simple, okay? Don't make them super, super complicated. They do have to be equal intervals, so I can't have one represent numbers 0 through 5, and then my next interval is numbers 6 through 20. No, they have to be equal amount of numbers in each interval. And what I mean by that is if my first interval is 0 to 5, then my next interval needs to be 6 to 11. Okay, 0 to 5 represents 5 numbers, 6 to 11 represents 5 numbers. So they have to be equal intervals. So for my data that I have here, I see that my lowest number is a 2 and my highest number is a 19. So honestly, I'm going to probably pick some pretty simple intervals here. I think I'm going to do an interval of 1 to 5 and then 6 to 10. So that's an interval of 4. That's an interval of 4. So then 11 to 15, that's an interval of 4. And then 16 to 20, that's an interval of 4. Okay, so those are going to be my intervals. I don't need this extra one here at the top. Now, the way that these intervals work is that for your frequency table at the top, this is going to be the number of times you see this number. So the number of times, or this is the interval. Sorry, I labeled that wrong. This is your interval. And then down here, we're going to put the tally of how many times we see that number. So for example, a number 1 through 5. So I have a 5 here, so I put a tally mark. So I took care of him. I have another 5, so I put a tally mark. This guy's a 6, so he goes in the next interval. The next one's an 11, so the next interval. 3 goes in that first interval. 6 goes in the second interval. 12 goes in the third interval. 2 goes in the first interval. 10 goes in the second. 16 goes in the last one. 19 goes in the last one. and then 12 goes in that third interval. So I've accounted for all of my numbers, and I have separated them out in the intervals. So that tells me that for these different intervals here, I have 4, I have 3, I have 3 again, and I have 2. Okay, so when I go to set up my histogram here, on the bottom is where I'm going to write my intervals. And then on the side is where we're going to write the frequency in which these intervals occurred. So here is going to be the frequency of how many times we saw those intervals. And I'm going to keep it really simple. I'm just going to count by ones because my intervals did not get that big. They only went up to 4. Okay? Or my tallies only got up to 4. So when I go to make my histogram, the big important thing is that you do not have any spaces between your columns. So my first column here is going to be 1 through 5, and that happened 4 times. So I go up to 4, and I draw a column. Now, I like to use different colors for my columns, and if I don't have colors, then I'll do different designs in my columns, because remember, there's not going to be any spaces between these columns, and so if you don't color them differently or do a design or something, then all of them look like one big blob, and so that can get kind of confusing at times. My next column is the 6 through 10 interval, and there were 3 of those, so again, no spaces between my columns, and I go ahead and I draw that next one. My third one is 11 through 15. There were 3 of those as well. So again, draw in that column. And then the last column is going to be 16 through 20, and there were only 2. And there you go. So that's how you make a histogram. Notice there are no spaces in between those columns. It's one big continuous data, and it represents all of my data numbers, how many I had for each one of those little intervals that I created there. Again, from the histogram, I cannot get my individual data, so I can't do things like the mean or the mode, because I can't see the actual individual data, so I don't know how many times these numbers are actually repeating. I just know that, hey, the majority of my data is pretty small numbers, 1 through 5. I have an equal amount of data there in the middle, 6 through 15, and then I have a couple numbers that are greater than 16 that go up to possibly 20. And again, I don't even know if I have a 20 or not, because again, you cannot see the individual data. Let's take a look at what data or information we can get off of a histogram. I've made a histogram here representing reading practice. We have the frequency of the number of students that read, and then down here below, my intervals represent reading time. So how many times, like during a week, does the student practice reading at home? So let's answer these questions. How many students have read 2 to 3 times a week? So 2 to 3 times, that is going to be this column right here. And so that is 20 students. So 20 students. That's how tall that column is. Oops. Let me redo that. There we go. 20 students. How many students have read more than 3 times a week? Well, more than 3 times a week would be these 2 columns right here. This would be more than 3 times. Okay, so that is 5 plus 15. So again, 20 students. Let's see, what's the next question? How many students were asked about their reading times? So this is where we get to add up all of the columns to see how many people were asked. So we have 10, 20, 5, and then 15. So 20 plus 10 is 30, 30 plus 5 is 35, and 35 plus 15 is going to be 50. So they asked 50 students. And so those are just some examples of questions that they could ask you about a histogram. They could ask you so many other things. Again, we can't really find the median because we don't know all the different data. We can't find the mode because we don't know which number is there the most. We just know that there's a bunch of numbers between 2 and 3. We cannot find the mean because, again, we don't have that individual data. We can't even really find the range because we don't actually know if we have any 7s or if all of these guys right here are all 6s. We don't know because we cannot see the individual data for this histogram. So it's really hard to answer some of those common questions about histograms. because you don't see that individual data. So a lot of the times they'll ask us questions about what the graph looks like, the different column amounts, things like that instead, because they can't ask us those mean, median, mode questions because we don't have all the data. All right, I hope that this helped answer any questions you had about histograms or clear up any confusion that you may have. I will talk to you later. Bye.